And then hey, good evening, everyone. Sorry for the little bit of a late start. We had some technical difficulties. However, I'd like to welcome you to the fourth Monday training series. It's co-sponsored by the Democratic Party of Bernalillo County and the West Side Dems. I'm happy to say I'm a member of both. And tonight we have a very interesting topic that has to do with getting out the vote in November. And those of us who've been volunteering so far in the last couple of months have been talking to a lot of Democrats. And now we're talking to more and more undecided or your declined to state voters in the case of New Mexico. The timing for this training couldn't be better. Before we get into our actual training program, I'd like to introduce Flora Lucero, who is the chair of the Democratic Party of Bernalillo County.
Thank you very much, Sue. We're so lucky to have you and your dedication to creating a more just and equitable democracy. And so good to be here, and thank you for those of you who are attending. This is being recorded, so we'll be able to play it back for others in the future, so it'll help more than just those who are here in attendance. And we wanted to make a couple of announcements. We are going to have sign distribution we have some Biden-Harris signs, and then also the coordinated campaign has their slate signs, which have Biden-Harris, future Senator Ben Ray Lujan, and then our representatives. and so those signs will all be available at Mariposa Park on the west side of Albuquerque from 10 to 1 on Saturday. That's the 3rd of October. So if you would like your signs, come on by them. Also having a ward chair meeting, Bob, I think you have signed up. That is going to happen on Wednesday. We're going to talk a little bit about the coordinated campaigns, get out the vote strategy, and we have a couple of other things that we're working on. So those are our 2 announcements. And at this time, Sue, do you want me to introduce Catherine?
I have 2 announcements for West Side Dems as well. And I'd like to welcome everyone. West Side Dems has mostly monthly programs that are very lively discussions of highly pertinent topics. And our next program is going to be this Wednesday in 2 days at 6 p.m. And if you haven't heard about it or registered for it, let me know in the chat box and I'll make sure that we send you the link for registration. The topic this meeting is to talk about what we call down ballot issues. And particularly this time, there's an issue on the ballot statewide that has to do with changing the way that members of our public PRC, regulatory, I can't ever remember.
Public Regulation Commission.
Commission, yeah. How they come into office. At current, they are elected, and there is a statement on the ballot to consider changing that. It's going to be a very lively discussion, and that is this Wednesday at 6 p.m. And then coming up in October, on October 21st at 6 p.m., we're going to be talking about the possibility of having state banking. In other words, a New Mexico sponsored state bank system. This is a topic that has been in discussion in many circles around the state for some time now. And again, the discussion will be Wednesday, October 21st at 6 p.m. That also is expected to be a lively one. That one is October. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
I don't think anyone's Okay.
Unmute. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our very special trainer, Miss Catherine Clark. She is a political strategist specializing in political messaging and swing district strategy. If you live in New Mexico, you may not yet know Catherine Clark, but you have known of her work because she was instrumental in running a 2018 campaign. She actually ran it with the highest Democratic turnout in the state. That campaign got. Catherine has a dual BA in cognitive neuroscience and interdisciplinary studies in ethical moral psychology. Her undergraduate work with George Lakoff is specifically examined the neuroscience of voting decisions and how it relates to ethical and moral psychology. She has an MBA in public policy and human resources. And in her past, she worked successful campaigns to protect affordable housing, served as a policy review commissioner, and served as a union organizer. Woohoo! So she's a graduate of Emerge, class of 2017, and we are so pleased to have her here to help us understand how to talk to independent voters.
Okay. Thank you so much, Flora, for the introduction. I'm Catherine, and I tend to talk fast. So if you have questions, just type them into the chat and I'll try to pay attention and see if there was something that I just need to review as I'm talking. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, but first you can't share your screen if you have to, okay. It's like a 3-step process. Okay, and then I have to press this button. Okay. All right, so Flora talked about it a little bit, but my research in undergraduate was really interested in how people make voting decisions and how that's based on our view of the world. You know, how we see the world influences how we vote. And so you can find a little bit about me if you want to email me. So this is a quote that's pretty, I think, important to talk about in this era of Trump, which is that this is what he sort of talked about, but this is actually what's known in politics as the Southern strategy, which is that you can convince the lowest white man that if he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. And it's this idea that when we activate in-group and out-group and use our social psychology, we can get people to vote against their best interest. Because voters are not rational. They're actually, you know, most decisions are actually emotionally based. And if you understand how people make decisions based on moral emotion, you will have a lot easier time convincing them of what you would like them to, you know, decide. So here's my outline. The facts don't work. It's a little research on Lakoff and this idea of cognitive metaphors. Robert Reich and sort of talked about this idea of the narrative, the political myth archetype. We're going to talk a little bit about moral intuitions and then basically how to talk to, you know, sort of the mapping of how you talk to persuadable voters. Okay, so the facts don't work. So people are largely driven by unconscious cognition and emotion over reason. And a really good example of that is Kahneman and Tversky won a Nobel Prize, where they show that people actually don't make rational decisions on, so like, let's say if you were gonna lose $1 or $2 or $3, it would seem like those amounts would be more risky, but actually bigger and bigger amounts seem more and more risky, and smaller amounts are less risky, but in a curve that's not straight, up like straight at a diagonal, but like a strange curve. And that curve can be influenced by your political persuasion, your gender, your income, right? So it's this idea that like a lot of things are going on in the background to influence how you perceive risk and how you make your decisions. So those, and an interesting finding we know in social psychology is in fact that if you try to convince someone with facts, so if you try to sort of attack their idea with facts, they're even more likely to believe what they believe, right? So it's like a defense mechanism. So trying to say, oh, but here's the facts on that situation, doesn't work, and it actually may push someone further away from your perspective. So political decisions are driven by emotion. People often guess incorrectly why they think what they think. So an example is if you do an experiment where you have people crossing a bridge, one is very high and one is sort of near the ground, and you have a girl at the end, and she offers her phone number to at the end of the experiment to the young man going across the bridge. The young man going across the bridge is more at the higher bridge is more likely to call the girl, and he will assume it's because he thought the girl was cute, but actually it's probably because his emotion was aroused and he didn't know it. So he made this false attribution about why he made the decision to call the girl. So people are very actually disconnected about why they make decisions, and they're very strongly influenced by even unconscious emotion. And moral emotions are things like pride, contempt, shame, guilt, and awe. And all of those emotions, a lot of them have to do with the fact that we are social creatures and are influenced by the presence of others. So when we're talking about voting decisions, it's not that you make a decision in the vacuum. Voting is really about the fact that we are part of a group, right? And the intergroup dynamics of being in groups. And I can't see, it's like the little, how do I minimize this bar? Oh, here we go. Okay, so I wanted to point out that political junkies, people who are really tuned in, probably are pretty well-informed voters, but the average person who's busy and has 3 kids and is trying to go to soccer practice is really making voting decisions based on impression and not really on facts, or, they think they are, but actually it's more strongly influenced by their impressions and intuitions. Okay. So there's something in politics we call the beer test. So the idea is that if voters are more likely to quote unquote have a beer with a candidate, they just like the candidate, they're more likely to vote for that candidate. So Donald Trump actually had more of a beer test. Like people were more interested in him and he was intriguing and wanted to have a beer with him than Hillary Clinton. So that was sort of an interesting way of talking about whether a candidate is going to sort of meet the sort of the average voter's sort of intuitive like or dislike of that candidate. Another way to sort of point this out is the National Election Study. They've been studying elections for 50 years. And the question that overwhelmingly influences whether or not a candidate or is correlated with whether or not a candidate is going to win the presidency is, does this candidate care about people like me? And that sort of taps into this idea, these sort of 3 fundamental components of a successful candidate. The first is trust. That's a foundation that you cannot violate. If you don't trust the candidate in some way, that candidate is unlikely to win. And actually women, particularly for female candidates, trust is easily violated and damaged. And once you damage trust for a female candidate, because people are less forgiving of women, it is very hard to get that back. So women have to defend their trustworthiness if they're a candidate really strongly. In social psychology, we always talk about warmth and strength, or warmth and competence, and it's the scale in which we judge people, and you have to have both. As a male candidate, you can get away with more competence and strength and less care and warmth. As a female, you must have warmth. You cannot be without warmth, and you have to have some competence, but actually the warmer you are, the more your competence suffers, and the more competent and strong you seem, particularly for women, the less care you're perceived to have. So it's like you have to have this balancing act and making sure that when you're talking to persuadable voters, that the candidate you're talking about, you try to tell them stories or facts about that person that will sort of imply all 3 of these characteristics. Okay, so here's this idea in cognitive metaphors in Lakoff. It's this idea that we have these conceptual metaphors. We frame things in a certain way, and it sort of is the underlying mechanism in which we have concepts and string concepts together. So this idea of a very classic cognitive metaphor is this idea of the mind as the container and ideas are things. So you put the ideas that are things in the container. So when we talk about ideas, we talk about things inside our head, or we lost it. It's sort of this way we talk, that's a metaphor about ideas. And we see these all over in our language. So this is not as important, but it's like love is a journey, and our brain is essentially organizing our ideas like this. And the important part about this is that when we are talking about concepts, we should not negate the concept. So this idea that Lakoff has is really important in his political speech, which is that you don't think of an elephant. That's what he called his book. Because essentially, if you say don't think about elephant, because you have to activate elephant in order to not think about it, you've actually activated that idea in the neural network. So when Nixon said, "I am not a crook," that automatically activated crook. And so people thought more likely that Nixon was a crook, right? So ways that Democrats tend to is that because they think rationally, and that if you just say this is not something, that people will automatically, sort of take that as fact, but you end up actually activating the very thing that you don't want to activate. And it's something very hard to do in political speech, especially if you set the language so that the person's trying to react to it. They tend to actually double down on the idea, and especially in a political attack, people are vulnerable to political attack because when they react, they tend to repeat the thing that was the attack. And you end up sort of doubling down on the idea and actually solidifying the attack in someone else, in the voter's mind. So I know this is a difficult concept to understand, but here's sort of an example. Love is a journey. So we went our separate ways. Look how far we've come. We talk about love as if it's a journey, and we map love onto journey. So lovers are travelers. Relationship is journey through time. Road conditions are relationship conditions. And the love frame, roles and relationships is determined by the journey frame, right? So there's like a perfect one-to-one mapping when we talk about love and relationships. And the classic in politics is that our country or our nation is a family, right? So it's like this in-group of a family. Founding fathers, Uncle Sam, children are citizens and community members, elected leaders are parents, parenting is our legal or policy system. And that's a metaphor that both parties use pretty consistently. And so we have two conflicting models in American politics of the nation family: nurturant parent model, which is how progressives see the world, and the strict father model, which is how conservatives see the world. So a strict father model is how conservatives tend to see the world. They see the world as very risky, with not a lot of resources that we're all competing for. And that means that there's a natural order that dictates that the father knows best, or the authority figure knows best, and he has a moral authority in which the children must listen, right? Otherwise, you're going to be, essentially, you're going to lose out on competing for valuable resources. It is a father's duty to punish children who violate his authority or the natural order. Punishment will make children self-sufficient, morally strong, and successful. Unsuccessful people are undisciplined and therefore are not moral because they are not doing what they need to do to succeed. And successful people, so they have this idea of the just world where successful people are successful because they're well behaved, and unsuccessful people are not successful because they're doing something wrong, and so we should not help them. Impediments to self-sufficiency are enabling immorality, so like welfare and protecting pre-existing conditions, and they violate the natural order. The world is unfair to people who are conservative with limited resources, so they really feel like it is the moral thing for them to do, to compete as hard as they can for just their limited in-group and not help anybody else because they're competing for limited resources. Like, the world is a tough place, right? So this idea of the strict father entails certain rules about the world, moral bounds. There are hard rules for right and wrong. Some people have moral authority as part of the natural order, right? So people who are in charge have a moral authority, and if you violate that authority, that's bad. Morality is obedience, right? So sort of obedience is powerful, and it makes sure that things are going to end up okay, and if we violate that, then bad things happen. This is idea of moral essence. Your behavior reveals your essence to good or bad. So people who are conservative tend to see other people as black or white and being essential. So someone's essentially good or essentially bad, and maybe you're born that way or you're predestined to be that way, and it's very hard to change. And this idea of moral health. So this idea that immorality catches. It can actually be a contagion. And so you have to get rid of it or else it can infect everybody else. So there's some conservative frame examples: healthcare repair, partial birth abortion, tax relief, right? We're being relieved from taxes, environmental regulations, which are bad, job creators, you know, those are people who create jobs, and it has this whole frame of like the people who are going out and they're the hero of the story. Tax and spend, Washington elites, those are the people who are oppressing you, they're the bad guys. Illegals, gay marriage takers, and radical Islamist terrorists. So the next model is the nurturant parent model. And these are people who are, tend to be progressive, see the world this way. Children and parents have mutual respect, responsibility, and caring for one another. Families are communities where parents seek to protect their children from external dangers. Parents instill values of self-care, caring for others, and open communication. They prefer punishments of restitution over retribution. Unsuccessful people deserve empathy and care, and they are part of our community, and we need to take care of them. So the entailments of a nurturing parent are morality as empathy. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Morality as nurturance. We must help others who need help. Morality as happiness. Unhappiness blocks nurturance. Therefore, pursuing happiness is moral. Morality as fairness. People benefit and are nurtured from impartial rules or equal opportunity. And morality as growth. Moral status isn't fixed, but people can learn and people can change. And so progressive frames that we tend to see are marriage equality, corporate welfare, right? That's the bad thing. Big tobacco, big pharma, big soda, this idea that big, bad, sort of ugly and anonymous things that are coming to get us. Reproductive health and healthcare, undocumented workers, environmental protections, workers' rights, safety net, public resources. And so there's this idea that frames have an inherent mythology. There's always going to be, when we're talking about in political speech, there's always a victim, there's a hero, and there's a villain, and there's a crime. And all of your frames, the way we talk about different issues, tend to have pretty implied crime, victim, villain, and hero. So in reproductive health, it's a violation of body choice. The victim is women, the villain are extremists, and the hero is the voter who makes sure they vote for a pro-choice candidate. When we talk about partial abortion, which is how Republicans are talking about abortion these days, the crime is murder, the victim are unborn babies, the villain is government, and the hero is voters who will vote for someone who will stand up for the unborn, the unborn, that's what we're calling them, the unborn. So all moral frames set up a moral crime that has an implied victim, villain, and hero, and usually the hero is a voter who has to save the victim from some sort of injustice. So there are things when we're talking about political speech that some words appear in both sides of the political frame, and it's the underlying frame that signals the exact meaning, and these are sort of contested categories and words. And it's useful for bridging arguments for moderates or persuadable voters, because the thing about persuadable voters is that they don't tend to have one frame or the other. They tend to have mixed framing in their background, and one frame over the other can be activated, but you have to be smart about how you activate those frames. So when we talk about contested words, we're talking about things like freedom and fairness and opportunity and patriotism, and things that kind of activate that bigger frame of the Union or the United States as a family. So what makes a good frame? So we try to activate that nation as a family model. It may not be the opposite wording. So basically, if we try to fight with tax relief, it does not always work. Tax relief is a really effective frame for Republicans, this idea that we're being relieved from the oppression of taxes. So when you're fighting against taxes, it's really hard to actually think of an opposing frame that you can immediately use. So it's always good to talk about sort of like public benefit and public health and trying to care for others and sort of switching the frame without necessarily trying to react to that frame. A good frame uses an implied crime or bad act to highlight a victim that needs to be saved by the voter. And this is really important. So a lot of people, when they're trying to appeal for help, particularly around, let's say the homeless, that's an example. If you're talking about the homeless and you activate all of this empathy and talk about how the conditions are really bad and how these people need help, and you don't make a specific ask that will help people relieve that discomfort of empathy, they'll actually end up dehumanizing the target. So essentially, if you're asking for help for homeless people, but you don't make a specific ask about homelessness, and you ask those people later what they think about homeless people, they will actually say, I don't like homeless people. I'm disgusted by homeless people. I feel contempt for homeless people. And that is largely driven by this idea that you haven't given them any mechanism by which to relieve that discomfort. So whenever you're asking voters, particularly persuadable voters, to do something about a victim, right? You're describing a victim and activating empathy around like Black Lives Matter or homelessness or kids who don't have enough to eat. You always make sure that you have a specific ask that they can do that will easily, like that, obviously these are huge problems, but try to simplify to something that they can do right now to relieve that discomfort, or they will end up actually going the opposite direction. So what makes a good frame is easily understood by a progressive or moderate base, avoids clunky language, combined with a universal language for activation. So basically we go back to the idea that you try to get back to the idea of making a community, a whole community, part of your frame. So we want people to be included in the in-group. So instead of saying, Republicans and progressives and creating this division, we say like our neighborhood or Albuquerque. You try to put everybody in this in-group so that way there isn't met with hostility, essentially. So here's sort of a different tact that we use when we think about how to persuade voters. And this is sort of an idea that all political speech has that archetype. And so all the political speech has a villain and a victim and a hero. But there's also this idea that we tend to talk about problems in our country in terms of these 4 archetypes. And we see these over and over and over again in our political problems and our sort of movements, in our ideologies. And a lot of these have to do that they just keep repeating each other. So the triumphant individual, the rod at the top, which is fear-based. There's a hope-based, which is for few people who are fear-based are the rod at the top. Many that are hope-based are the benevolent community that take care of each other. Many of the fear is the mob at the gates. We see that a lot in sort of the xenophobia that's happening on the right now. So here's examples of the 4 parables that we see over and over and over again in political speech. The triumphant individual is entrepreneurs, Donald Trump, Barack Obama. The benevolent community are things like veterans and public schools and religious charities. Right at the top is the government, latte liberals, liberal media, corporations, drain the swamp. And that's sort of activating those archetypes that we have inherent in our culture. Enemy at the gates are like radical Islamist terrorists, illegal immigrants, foreign-based corporations. And that's just how these sides are talking about these issues, but they're automatically activating things that we have deeply ingrained in how we perceive sort of our mythology or our past. So these are Trumpisms. And the thing about Donald Trump is that he's pretty good at this stuff. I don't know if it's Donald Trump or Roger Stone, but Trump is pretty good at identifying our parables and using them to his advantage. So the triumphant individual, a tremendous Donald Trump and tough people, good people on both sides. The benevolent community, he talks about miners and workers. At the rod at the top, he talked about drain the swamp, which I thought was very, very effective, or the Washington elite. Enemy at the gates, he talked about radical Islamist terrorists at first, and that didn't quite work. So then he started talking about build the wall. And now he's talking about law and order and Antifa. So what would our progressive parables be? We'd talk about dreamers, right? That's a really good frame. Small business owners, Barack Obama. We talked about the benevolent community, which are miners and teachers and workers and unions. We talk about rod at the top as being corporate welfare or evil Wall Street, or in this case, because now Donald Trump's in charge, we're talking about Donald Trump's corruption. An enemy at the gates, maybe Russia working with the election, or maybe Republicans trying to take our elections. Also, income inequality is something that we talked about, sort of like bad people trying to make the world unequal. So then there's this third idea that's called the moral intuition theory. And Jonathan Haidt found that there are 5 essential moral intuitions that underline moral reasoning: harm, fairness, in-group, out-group effects, authority, and purity. And what I have found is that liberals tend to be much more persuaded by arguments around fairness and harming others, right? Making sure we're taking care of each other. And conservatives are much more persuaded by arguments involving in-group and out-group membership or patriotism, authority, sort of violations of authority, or purity and disgust, although that's not always true. And a good discussion with a persuadable voter will actually use both of these in a clever way to try to get that person listening to. So instead of just sounding like a liberal, what you want to do is sort of pepper a little bit of this sort of ideas throughout your conversation so that people will be convinced. So reframing liberal arguments with in-group membership, patriotism, or purity, and conservative arguments with fairness and harm is persuasive. So it's this idea that like you would take a liberal argument and you'd make, so like let's take paid sick leave. If you talk about paid sick leave as we need to take care of other people, very conservative voters don't care. They don't think that someone who hasn't been responsible enough to get a good job should be taken care of. However, if you say, we don't want people in restaurants wiping their hands and then, you know, touching your food, or we don't want grocery workers packing your groceries when they're sick, because it has a disgust element, actually conservatives and moderates will go, yeah, I agree with that. I don't want that. So you have to think about when you're making an argument to someone, try to frame it with sort of the values that they actually are much more likely to be persuaded by. Okay, so I'm not going to get totally into this because I know we're running out of time. This is the things that Trump does very well about frames, but it's sort of like advanced. Like we could talk about that forever. So this is sort of a frame that Ronald Reagan used a lot, that government is the rod at the top, they're bad, they're evil, and we need to get rid of them. So framing in the 2016 election was populism, right? Economic versus political. Not Trump actually activated Trump. Never Trump actually activates Trump for people. Race and gender played a significant role in this election because Donald Trump used it very effectively to his advantage. He basically divided groups and said, they are the problem. They're the reason why you don't have the things that you used to have, right? Make America great again. And it was this implied Southern strategy that worked really, really well. And activating race makes more people endorse the Tea Party. That's actually a study that was found to be true. So this idea of activating groups to attack each other works really, really well for conservatives. In the 2020 election, what we're seeing is the same thing, in-group and out-group effects with the law and order, the enemy of the gates. So the enemy of the gates are not immigrants anymore. They are people who are in Portland and in New York, and they're taking to the streets, and those are the bad people, and they're gonna destroy our hierarchy, and we need to do something about them. And law and order works pretty well. It's a very effective tool for getting people to vote conservatively. Protests initially had support, but it is now dwindling based on polling, and that I think it has to do a lot with the fact that people feel like it's a big problem and they can't do anything about it, and so they've become exhausted. And so when we're messaging why we're protesting, we should always talk about the specific things that everyday people can do to support these ideals of anti-racism and making sure we have equality and not having people killed in the street. Right at the top, Donald Trump corruption is working for Dems. So one of the things that we're noticing is that, again, right at the top, it's that archetype. Donald Trump, when we talk about his corruption, it works for Dems. When we talk about breaking the promise of care, which is pre-existing conditions, you know, people shouldn't be punished for having a pre-existing condition. That's working very, very well. Okay. So here's some caveats, and this is not because I actually personally believe this, but it's what we are finding in the research. So for instance, in some of the parts of Albuquerque, when you say defund the police, the Democrat loses by 50 points. Black Lives Matter seems to be activating a very hostile segment of the population, and not just conservatives, but moderates. And I think that has to do with that idea that because it seems like such an overwhelming problem, like racism, if it's really as bad as progressives are saying, it just seems so overwhelming that I think it's being approached with sort of a hostile, like, I can't deal with that. The idea is that we should not reframe it as all lives matter in a colorblind reframing, but we should talk about multicultural frames. American diversity is our strength. We have a melting pot. Everyone should be treated fairly. No matter what zip code you're born in, you should be able to feel safe and supported by your government. This idea that police have a few bad apples activates a purity frame, but it doesn't capture the systemic issues in police culture. And so, you know, you have to be thoughtful, but there are frames that progressives are using right now, which are actually creating hostility among persuadables. And so trying to sort of work in multicultural frames will also help your argument. Okay, so how do you approach persuadable voters? So we sort of talked about these theories of how people think morally, and sort of persuadable voters are in the middle. They tend to be in the middle. They tend to mistrust both sides and see both as extreme, and they also tend to think that they're just not working together well, and they're fed up. Like a lot of our persuadable voters in Albuquerque are very, very frustrated. They don't see the country is going the right way, but they don't know who can actually solve it for them. So that's an opportunity for us. They want government to work, but they also don't want it to interfere with their daily life. Their nurturant parent model can be activated, but first you have to become their in-group, right? So the idea is that they have to trust you. They have to decide that you're one of them, and you're not approaching them by being an outsider telling them what to do, but more like, I'm your neighbor. So when you call a persuadable voter, the first thing you should say is, hi, I'm your neighbor. So there are very strong outgroup effects among persuadable voters, and that is a kiss of death for progressives, because as soon as the outgroup effect, in-group outgroup effect, and just to clarify, an in-group outgroup effect is where you see I'm in one group and you're in the other group, and I will do anything I can to block you. So we want to make sure that people who are persuadable voters perceive you as being like them. And the second thing you should do is control your contempt. So overwhelmingly, I think because of Donald Trump, liberals are feeling morally superior, and it shows. So if you look all over Facebook, we're calling conservatives stupid or Nazis or awful or racist. And the problem is that contempt is quite hostile, and people can smell it on you pretty quickly. So they did a study where they showed if the wife has even just a flash of a micro expression of contempt just one time in a 30-minute period, that predicted a divorce. So contempt is poison. And so when we are talking to persuadable voters, we have to suppress our contempt. Even if they say things that we disagree with, that we really, really control that. So conservatives believe in what they do because of their backgrounds and who they are. And I think that's a really important idea to keep in your mind, is that try to have empathy for people who don't agree with you, because they are sort of a composite of their experiences in life, and we should treat them as individuals, not as a monolith, right? So try not to dehumanize just conservatives or persuadables as a certain way, right? Try to understand who they are, and that will help control your contempt. So contempt is, as I said, a predictor of failed marriages, friendships, and work relationships. It automatically creates in-group, out-group effects. So essentially, if someone even sniffs that you feel superior to them, because that is the definition of contempt, you feel morally superior to someone, they will immediately treat you with hostility. And actually, they'll treat you more with hostility than it's this amazing effect where even if they'll lose money, as long as that you get to lose more money than them, they will bet against you every time. And it creates this incredible dysfunctional hostility. So we want to make sure that we work very hard on being empathetic and not being contemptuous, even if they say things that we particularly perceive are racist or awful or xenophobic or, just seem maybe misinformed to us. Okay. Another thing we have to do is also try to increase our vulnerability. So one of the most powerful ways we can get people to feel empathy with us and also feel like we're in the same group is to show some degree of vulnerability. So instead of talking about facts or statistics or sort of why one thing is better than the other, talk about your fear and your anxiety. Talk about what you're worried about. Talk about how you're frustrated by that things don't seem to be, that people aren't helping each other anymore. A good sort of mixed frame is talking about, the good old days, because conservatives tend to see the world as like they tend to be nostalgic, and progressives tend to see the future. So one of the ways that you can sort of gain access to a persuadable voter is to talk about things in a nostalgic way, but also in a hopeful future way. So it could be like, I wish we could get back to, or I wish we could see again when neighbors used to care for each other. So you're activating the care frame, but in a way that conservatives relate to, because they tend to see the world from the past. So obviously when you're talking about your fear and anxiety, you could say things like, I really wish people would care for each other like they used to, and we could be like that again. Nothing should seem over the top, right? Like it's not a drama, like you're not sort of going overboard. But if you reveal some level of authentic vulnerability, that really generates trust and it activates empathy. And empathy is one of the most powerful ways of generating in-group bonds. And that's when you can start having a real conversation. So one of the ways that we do think you should be vulnerable, we also think you should tell a personal story. So because people are not very persuaded by facts, it's really good to tell a personal story about why, sorry, I don't know why this, oh, here we go. So when we're telling a personal story, we want it to sort of hit these things. We want it to be authentic. We want it to generate empathy. We want it to create trust. We want it to open a dialogue, and we want to focus the conversation around these topics, right? So if you tell sort of a little story about maybe why you're making calls, or why you got involved in politics, or why you're worried and why you're becoming so active, or why you're making this phone call, or like what initially got you excited about this candidate. If you make sure you craft that story to sound authentic, but also that sort of reveals vulnerability, but also kind of frames the reason why you're calling around, like, I'm really concerned about us as Albuquerque and about our city, and I want to make sure we put the right people in office that can really fix things for us. So there's a worksheet which I can send people, but essentially we want people to sort of think about the moments that they started volunteering about democratic causes, or had a moment or an aha moment about why they care about, or why they're voting Democratic, or why they've become a Democrat. And so when you sort of think about these, where your values come from, then you can figure out how to craft a story that will make you vulnerable, make you empathetic, but also make you authentic about how you can reach people. So the idea here is that when you're talking to persuadable voters, you want to always make sure that you talk about your issue and why you're calling them, and you tell your personal story, and you sort of share, right? Like, it shouldn't just be you talking. You tell a little 5-minute, 2-minute story, and then you try to get them to open up about talking about their issue. So a good persuasion conversation lasts about 20 minutes, right? You tell a little bit about why you're calling, and then you ask them, well, what do you think? Like, what do you think about how our neighborhood's doing? What do you think about our healthcare? What do you think about the economy? And then you always make sure to try to make the voter the hero. When you're done, you can say, I really care about this candidate, Melanie Stansbury, for instance. Like, she cares about us so much. She's so passionate. I know she works so hard. She always, works hard for her constituents, and is trying to make sure that we have bills that protect our environment and take care of small businesses. And I really wish that you could, or I really hope that I can count on your vote for her. And try to make the voter the hero. Make sure that there's a very specific ask. And make sure that when you're talking about your candidate, if you choose to tell stories about your candidate, make sure you always hit all these three. Warmth and care, right? So Melanie cares about us. She cares about our environment. Strength and confidence, like she's doing a great job at the legislature. She's working really hard to pass bills. Some of her bills have been bipartisan, and so she can really improve our outcomes, and we can trust her. So try to hit these three things when you're talking about your candidate. And when you're talking in a script as just a Democratic voter, this is not this kind of conversation. But when you're talking to persuadable voters, where this conversation is going 20 minutes, it's really important to hit these three, because these are the three emotions or the three characteristics that will really persuade persuadable voters. So in summary, framing is used to talk and activate your base. Avoid using and activating the opposing side's frames, right? So if you hear a frame like partial birth abortion, don't use that, ignore that and use what the progressives are using for framing. Make sure that you are using the moral foundations, this idea of the archetypes, if you can, and the sort of moral emotions that we talked about, the in-group, out-group effects, purity. And then parables are helpful in creating moral narratives, right? So it's helpful in sort of deciding, okay, can I find an archetype that will sound so familiar that the person will just go, aha, when I'm talking to them about what this problem is that we're dealing with. So I wanted to stop. And I know that was like a lot of information, but that's sort of how we deal with, that's how we're sort of, when we're talking to persuadable voters, that's what we do. We sort of think about, okay, they're not no one makes rational decisions. We all use our emotions. How do we create empathy so that person sees us not as the enemy, but as someone who is like them? And then how do we have conversations that are using things that will sort of seem familiar so that when we're having a conversation about an issue, it will activate the more progressive frame rather than the conservative frame, which will, of course, lead them down the path of voting for a conservative candidate. Does anybody have any questions? I know that was like really a lot.
That was awesome, Catherine.
So I actually think that an example of New Mexico, so I think Ben Ray uses frames pretty effectively. I don't know if he knows he's doing it, but I know that I've seen it. I think that, I'm trying to think of who else uses it really effectively. So in like a lot of the caucuses now are using mail programs, so like mail vendors that are really working on making sure that their writing has these kinds of frames in them. So if you read some of their mail pieces, you can see that they're really working hard to make sure that there is persuasive language. Yes, I can make sure my presentation is available on Slack. But I thought we could like practice, right? Like we could try to like pretend like we're talking to a persuadable voter and think about how to come across as I'm in your in-group. I am revealing to you that I'm vulnerable. I am authentic. And here's a little story about me. And then, you know, switch to, so tell me like, what do you think about education? What do you think about the economy? And like, once you get into that conversation, like that should usually take you about 2 minutes. And then you get them to talk. And then as you move towards the end of the conversation, you talk about why you're supporting your candidate and try to emphasize these 3 characteristics, because they really do mean voters will be like, you know, I don't know anything about this Democrat. I don't necessarily always vote for a Democrat, but I like that this person who seemed like me, who I could relate to, called me and said that they were trustworthy. Does anyone want to practice? Sue, come on, I'm going to put you on the spot. You're on mute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay. So, okay, how do I start again?
I think, Sue, you should try to call Flora. And Flora, you are a persuadable candidate. You are right down the middle. You vote for both kinds of candidates. You are frustrated by the way the country is going because you feel like they are fighting children in Congress, right? And that's the perfect opportunity for Sue to call and talk about how local candidates can really actually make a difference. Doesn't really matter. I mean, yes, it matters what the federal is doing, but we can really change how New Mexico is operating. And we're doing a pretty good job with COVID, don't you think, right? So these are the kinds of conversations we can have to try to sort of stay out of national politics and focus more on local politics. So Sue, I'm going to have you call Flora, and Flora, you're going to be kind of a hesitant, persuadable voter.
Okay.
Ding, ling, ling.
Yes. Hello.
Hi, my name is Sue, and I'm one of your neighbors here in Albuquerque, and I am calling about the election that's coming up, and I have a candidate that I think would be super great for our Albuquerque needs.
Oh, well, thank you for calling, Sue.
Well, I'd like to tell you about my candidate. My candidate is Damon Eli, and he is my state representative who has really done good things for people across New Mexico, and especially here in Albuquerque. Would you like to hear a little bit about him?
So Sue, I feel like you've just launched into like a fact bio of Damon.
Okay.
And so what I'd like you to do is think about trying to convey that sort of like, so, hi, my name is Sue, I'm your neighbor, and you know, I'm calling on behalf of Damon Eli. You know, I've actually been really worried lately about when schools are going to open, or, you know, whatever you think is sort of like will make you seem like you are a genuine, authentic, you know, you're not just writing a script, right? You are your neighbor.
Okay. Okay. I'll start over. Ding, ling, ling.
And maybe tell a story about why you like Damon more than the facts about Damon.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks. How about you?
I'm good. My name is Sue, and I'm a neighbor of yours here in Albuquerque. And I am calling to tell you about a candidate that I believe is going to do some good things for us. His name is Damon Eli. He's been in for 2 terms, and I am thrilled about him because in the special session, he's been working so hard to make sure that all the New Mexicans in so many different categories and walks of life are receiving some assistance and help to weather through the pandemic. I think that is one of the biggest issues in our state. What do you think?
It's a huge one. I don't know how we're going to get out of this. It's just a mess.
Well, I don't know how we're going to get out of it, but I do know some candidates who are running who have some good values in terms of trying to help New Mexicans overcome these problems. And Damon is one of them. I've had the privilege of meeting him a few times, and I'll tell you, he's a straight shooter, and we need straight shooters right now more than ever.
Boy, do we ever. That's for sure.
Yeah. So can I count on your vote for Damon, or is that too soon?
Yeah, because I think you got to try to get her talking. So
Okay.
so what I'd say is what have you noticed about, do you think our small businesses are okay? Do you think, what's going on with parents? My grandkids. So trying to make it personal, my grandkids are at home and I'm really worried about them falling behind. I mean, I think acknowledging fear and anxiety, particularly in this era, is really important.
Mm-hmm. It's been really tough on New Mexicans across the state.
No, we're just talking about New Mexicans. You need to talk about yourself.
Okay. Okay. It's been really tough on me getting through this pandemic. I'm an older person, vulnerable, if I would catch the COVID. It's very scary, so I have to protect myself. But I'm also very concerned about our businesses and our schools around New Mexico. They need help to be able to do the things they need to do. And I think that is one of the biggest issues we should be asking all of our candidates right now. Do you agree with that? What do you think?
Well, I can certainly relate. We're stuck between so many things that just seem unfixable right now with our economy. And I know people in small business that then have had to shut their doors or they're near shutting their doors. But I don't think we have enough resources to really help them out. And I don't know.
So Sue, what I would say there, she says, I don't know, but then you can say would you want the government to give out small grants? How would you, I'm interested in knowing what my neighbors think about, what would help look like? Because you get their brain kind of thinking about what does help look like, then you sort of activated those helping, right? Because government should be helping. Because the conservative frame is government shouldn't help, they're bad. But the progressive frame is that we should help people who are in trouble, right? We should lift all boats. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to say that. You can ask them to think about it, and then it kind of activates that for them.
You raise a valid point there. Have you thought about any ideas of what kind of help you think would be helpful to, say, small business owners? As you say, you've known some who've had to shut their doors. What do you think would help them?
Well, I think some grants for them and not based necessarily on their credit, because right now so many of them, their credit's been dinged. So how can they have a good credit report? And that's what a lot of these grants are doing. So they need just to be able to apply for a grant because they were doing well before.
Mm-hmm. So Flora just revealed that she is thinking about things in terms of fairness. Mm-hmm. So you could re-emphasize that, which is a progressive value, and say, you're right, that would be unfair if we were to punish businesses for not doing well in COVID. We really need to make sure that just because you're not doing well in COVID doesn't mean you can't be successful, after this passes. We just have to get people through it, right? Mm-hmm. And as you can see, that's an allegory for other kinds of programs, right? So you're just sort of trying to reemphasize these values, and you can say, and Damon has actually been really he in the legislature during the special session, he helped support a bill that had grants for businesses. He's personally reached out to me as his constituent to make sure I'm okay, you know, whatever you want to say. Like, you know, I really think we need Damon in the roundhouse. I think he's doing a good job. And I think when the next session comes up, when it's really going to be making tough decisions about how best to care for New Mexicans, because, you know, our economy is not doing that well. We know that things are, maybe budgets might be tight. You know, I know we can trust Damon to make the right decision, right? So.
Yeah. Okay.
You touched on the trust,
Yes.
the warmth, and the strength,
Competence.
confidence.
Yep.
All three of them.
Yeah. And it takes practice.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It's really hard because I think Democrats are used to getting a script and here's some facts, right? But like, no, we don't want to be robots. We want to be like, I'm a neighbor, I'm worried, and the reason I'm calling you is because this worry or this anxiety has caused me to get active and start reaching out to my neighbors to let them know about this candidate, because I'm worried if we don't elect this person, right? So, and like if they try to go Donald Trump or they try to go Joe Biden, you know, honestly, like there are going to be some people who vote for Trump, but will vote for your local candidate. Just like that's just how it's going to be. So I wouldn't even get into the Trump. I mean, if they volunteer it as like, oh, everything's so disastrous, you can be like, yeah, it just seems so crazy right now. You know, I want to get back to when we could trust that competent people were running things. But like that's why I'm so passionate about this candidate. You know,
it's interesting, Catherine, because you raised an emotion in me that I've been feeling since RBG passed, sadly. And that is, I feel like somebody kicked me in the gut, and I feel really scared about the national election. But I have doubled my efforts locally.
Yeah.
Because that is something that can directly affect our lives.
Yes.
And I think what I'm seeing now is this is a good way to have that discussion at the local level. I like it. I can resonate with it.
Yeah. And so so it's usually the story I tell is like, oh, you know, I'm calling on behalf of candidates. I'm really, you know, got involved in politics because, you know, I saw, I actually used to be a union organizer. And when I was a union organizer, my university, for all of its liberal ideals, fired 3 workers, longtime workers without notice. And one of them was dying of leukemia, and he only needed 8 more weeks of pay in order for his wife to qualify for his pension, but they fired him anyway. And what we did is we organized and we got together and we got that university to allow us to donate to his, you know, donate days so that he could get those 8 weeks of work. And he died anyway while we were doing it, but his wife did get his pension. But it just occurred, you know, it just made me realize that unless we stand up for the little guy, there's going to be all these big forces trying to crush us. So when I support a candidate, it's because I know that they stand up for the little guy, like you and me. And so, you know, that's why I'm supporting Damon and I. See, like you have to tell this story, and then
And that's a feel-good story too. That's
a
story of yes, we can
yes.
do this.
Yeah. So like I think it's important to show vulnerability. It's important to seem authentic, because I don't think you guys didn't believe that story, right? Like that felt like a real story. It wasn't mopey or maudlin, right? It was just like, here's why I am so passionate about making calls to my neighbors, right? So, and you always have to make sure you try to get them to think that, like, you know, because these problems that we're talking about, like racism, they're so overwhelming. That's why they're met with hostility, I think, is because it is so overwhelming, and it's so foreign to people who have so much privilege. They just don't even, like, they don't know. So like when, you know, it's just like, it just seems so like insurmountable, I think. So I think problems that are insurmountable are hopeless and very frustrating for people who are just trying to feed their kids, get them to school, you know, do the Zoom schooling and figure out how to pay their mortgage, right? So you want to give them a simple thing that's like, you know, try to indicate that you're not crazy, that you're vulnerable, that you're like them, and that you are supporting this candidate that they can also support because, you know, you've established trust with them. So like persuadable voters don't respond very well to just a script, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of times we are just given the script, and it's a lot easier to go off of a script. But to really change a mind, that's something different.
And
very
that's
important.
why it's always so important to know the criteria they use to pull the names of your target audience. Is very important for the callers to know that. You know, that's something that they never tell you unless you ask. You have to specifically ask.
Yeah.
That kind of helps put me in the right mindset. And another thing I'd like to add, if it's okay, is that I have found text banking to be a lot more productive than phone banking, because you can have a little bit of these kinds of spurts of conversation. And you have to be careful, because you have to make sure you get your point across real quick, because I think about 3 interchanges is about all, you know, that people are going to tolerate. But that gives you, you know, an opportunity to do this in a less seemingly intrusive way.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the reason why I talk about vulnerability, because I think Brene Brown, you know, she's kind of like pop culture-y, but I think she really hits on that idea that vulnerability is very powerful, because it's essentially saying, I am no more superior to you, right? It's like, I feel comfortable, I trust you enough, and we're equal, so I can be vulnerable with you. And whatever, you know, whether we're talking about social psychology or cognitive linguistics, you know, all of these ideas are from different fields. It's that same idea that the snippet is really important. This if you get really good at persuadable voting, you don't ramble on, like you get your point across really succinctly, and then the other person can respond and feel comfortable doing so. And I like the idea that you're texting, you feel like you can actually, it's funny, you feel more comfortable on text because probably it's not as awkward. I mean, I know calling persuadable voters can be very awkward. To be authentic and vulnerable can be very awkward, especially if sometimes they initially will be hostile towards you, right? And you have to be able to just like let that go. You know what I mean? So, and sometimes they'll say something really offensive, like they'll call immigrants, you know, illegals, right? Because I was using that just to demonstrate how that was a frame, but like they will say some things that are just like, ooh, you know, and you just have to try to break through it and talk about your candidate, you know, because like persuadable voters are not necessarily perfect, right? They have a mix of things that they've been hearing. So
that idea that, you know, contempt is hostile, I think that's oftentimes a very difficult one to overcome, because, you know, like you said, they're saying, you know, oh yeah, those, they're othering, and
yeah,
like,
the othering. But we do it too. I mean, my Facebook feed is filled with people who are liberals saying not nice things about conservatives. And one of the ways in which conservatives have been very effective at getting blue collar or sort of maybe traditionally not college educated voters to vote against liberals is because they call us the coastal elite or the latte liberals. And I do think that there is a classism element sometimes, or we tend to call people stupid who don't necessarily automatically agree with us. So that contempt, I think, has done us in a lot of, like, so we have lost a lot of gubernatorial elections based on this idea that we think we're superior. I mean, it really is powerful. People really hate it. And so like, even if our policies are going to help them, it creates so much hatred. So, you know, it's so important to even in our friend groups, like if you see it in your Facebook page, just gently would sort of suggest like, that is not as persuasive as, you know, sort of hopeful messages. Like there's a reason why Obama did so well, and that's because he did the hopey changey. You know, hopey changey are future looking, forward thinking, the future is bright kind of messaging, not you suck, right? You suck does not help.
Well, it's kind of like you need to be honest and consistent, because as progressives, I think we really do care about people, and we want to care about all people, not just our in-group. That's what makes us quote unquote progressives.
Yes.
And that we can't really convey that message honestly if one side of our mouth is contemptuous towards one group of people, while we're claiming to be the party and the people of respect and caring for people.
I had a guy from Curry County tell me one time the reason why he voted for Republicans is because Democrats have lots of promises, but they will screw you, but be nice to you while smiling. You know, the conservatives are screwing you, but at least they're honest about it, right? Like, so for him, it was like, you know, that sort of that contempt, but also saying, but we're here to help, seemed really not trustworthy, so and inauthentic. So I think, you know, whatever happens, progressives have to acknowledge that the reason why people think what they think is because of who they are, and try to see them as individuals, not as a monolith, but as people who, because of their background, or maybe they grew up in a rural area, and when you're in a rural area, if you don't follow crop rules, like you lose your farm in one season, right? It's very risky. So ideas like revolution and big change is very scary. So try to understand this idea that like people may come, like, so there's actually a really interesting study by professors at Berkeley that studied when kids become conservatives or Democrats, and the kids who got teased a lot and were picked on were the kids who became conservatives. And I think that's because they saw the world as being unfair, fundamentally unfair. And you have to stand, you know, you have to fight for everything you get. And why should I focus on anyone else when like, I'm just trying to get by? And I think that like, you know, maybe that's just in a liberal place, those kids become conservative, but I thought it was a very interesting perspective on how people see the world influences their political position. And so it's really important for liberals to just be like, I don't understand why they just can't understand the facts. Like, that's just not how they see the world. So try very hard to assume that everyone has come to their political position honestly. I mean, unless you're like a politician, that's a whole other thing. But like for the average person, they have come to their opinion honestly, and, you know, try to meet them halfway.
That you brought up something else too with hostility that I thought was interesting, that how it creates, contempt creates hostility, and folks go out of their way to punish the unjustly superior.
That's correct.
And I thought, wow, that's, you know, that just explains so much of what we're seeing these days, you know, that with this boat's going to sink, you know, I'd rather see us all sink because we're acting like such a shit.
Yes. Yes. And especially persuadable voters, because they're just mad at both sides for just being children and not getting along. That's really how they see both parties right now, partisans just fighting and nothing's happening, or it's just, it's like nastiness and like one-upsmanship, but not real dialogue and like how we move forward. You know, there is, I mean, I think they wish they would just like all we'd throw ourselves into the sea at this point. I mean, they're really frustrated. So I think acknowledging that frustration can be very helpful. I think voters, I think when you think someone is contemptuous of you, like they think they're superior to you and they don't deserve to be, yes, you will go out of your way to punish them. There's a lot of good, interesting studies about, you know, in gambling games, how people, if they feel like they've been snubbed by someone who is no better than them, they will actually lose money in an effort to make that person lose more money, right? They will actually put themselves in harm's way just to punish the other person. So it's, you know, like contempt is really a powerful moral emotion. It is, and it's not just in a vacuum, right? It's a social emotion, which means for every action, there is a reaction in that kind of continuum. So.
Do you
it's
have
the
any
road rage thing.
exercise that someone can do before they get on the phone to lessen that contempt feeling?
So I think you have to, like I was talking about, you have to see every voter as a conglomeration of their own experiences, right? That they have come to their experiences fairly, right? That they are just made up of what they've experienced. Maybe they were a kid whose parent like spanked them a lot, or maybe they were a kid who was in foster care and they see the world as a hard place, you know, or maybe they're a kid who like grew up in a really strict environment and were taught that you know, the sort of idea of the just world where like good things come to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And that's what they've just been taught. They don't, you know, they have, but because they're in that mentality, they just have never seen it any other way. Like I don't, you know, but most people like, so I think when partisans tend to see the world as divided, you know, like everything is extreme. So if we're all over here or we're all over there and there's no one in the middle. But actually, you know, just based on the bell curve, most people are somewhere in the middle. We are becoming more polarized, but it's nowhere than just two amplitudes, right? So two curves and nothing in the middle. So most people have some combination of progressive and conservative ideas. So try to talk to the more progressive side of them. Try to be persuasive, but also for sure, you know, like, try not to get ruffled by the conservative part, right? I mean, they probably heard that from their dad, or they probably heard that from their, you know, an important adult in their life, or, you know, that's just they've had a tough road, or they are from a rural area and truly, you know, if they didn't do exactly what they needed to do, like, I mean, I find rural people much more conservative because if they don't get their crops exactly right, they lose their farm. I mean, it's very risk, and they're very risk averse because of that. So I think trying to relate to them in terms of like, they must be a part of their, like they must be a amalgamation of their experiences, to see them as individuals. Like when we dehumanize people, that's when we treat them violently in a way. And contempt is violent, you know?
Yeah, thank you for that.
So. And it's hard. Sometimes I'm just like, I cannot today, you know? So like.
No, and especially whenever you're not meaning to be contemptuous,
Yeah.
but it's coming out, and then they smell that and it's like shark on blood, right? And all of a sudden they're attacking you and you're like, oh wait, no. So
It's hard. And like, you know, I mean, so, you know, morality is very interesting in that we, you know, religions tend to be interested in purity around relationships and purity around eating and purity around things, because the moral violations around purity are really powerful. So when, like for people who have strict diets based on maybe environmentalism, try talking to a cattle farmer and like their whole worldview is saying that you are immoral. Like that doesn't go well, you know what I mean? So, but you could have a shared conversation about, I want to make sure that we don't damage our environment so much that we can't feed people in 20 years. Like that, we both have that goal, right? So.
I just checked the clock and we've got about 5 more minutes, and I'm wondering if the participants tonight would feel comfortable sharing 1 or 2 new things, you know, we've learned, or one thing we think we want to try to improve our demeanor when we're discussing these issues with folks with whom we don't agree. Does anybody want to take a stab at that?
I'll start. My notes here, I got 3 pages. Facts can drive people away, you know, to try to be more connected, find, like you were saying, find common ground, and empathy is you know, building trust is important. Voters make decisions based on impressions more than facts.
Mm-hmm.
Like the big thing I learned is I got to ditch the contempt
It's very hard, but
right off the bat, right at step one. That's where I've got to start. You know, there's so much in that presentation, and you get to step one and say, okay, you work in step two, you get to step three, then you forget about step one. So it's something that I'm going to have to read over and over to become familiar with and absorb. You've definitely got advantage on us. You've been working this for a while, and so.
yeah, it was my undergraduate thesis. So,
Hey, Bob, I think we could form a little group to just practice,
yeah,
you know, with the folks who are on tonight, and then, you know, word of mouth, just let it, you know, put the seed out there and see what happens.
And any resources, Catherine, that you can recommend, like, you know, there are any videos or anything like that?
yeah. I can get you some videos on, like, so Brene Brown has a pretty good TED Talk on vulnerability. And I think even though it's sort of made in kind of like layman's pop psychology terms, I think her arguments relate to this topic. I can get you the handout on building your personal story. I mean, we learned a lot about that in Emerge, and it's for the very similar reasons, which is we're trying to demonstrate these 3 characteristics about our candidacy, but there's no reason why a person who's trying to be the trusted source on the phone shouldn't have a personal story too. And there's a few other TED Talks I can show you on, like, the contempt piece. And one of the reasons why contempt is so cool is that it's universal. Like, it's not perfect for every culture. Some cultures have less contempt, but it is a like, there are all these universal emotions, right? They found in the 60s that people have universal emotions, and you can see on someone's face and hear it in their voice. We're very sensitive to it. We're very sensitive to when people feel superior to us. And in an instant, we can tell when someone feels contempt. So it is something I would actually consider saying that you should record yourself when you're talking to someone, and then see if someone else thinks that it's an empathetic. If it sounds
Even just playing it back to yourself, I think it's very revealing. You hear things in your voice that, you know, you don't hear when they're coming out of your mouth.
And, like, you know, people are, even if they don't consciously could put their finger on it, they won't like you because maybe they hear it, you know? So yeah, so I can send you some stuff. I just, like, this is really hard to do, but once you get good at it, people actually really enjoy it because they talk to people that are unlike them, and they learn a lot about people outside of their bubble. Right? How people interpret events that are happening right now, for instance, like what's going on in crime or what's going on in the city, that you see it one way, but they interpret it in a completely different way. And it's always interesting to see how other people are reacting to, you know, you get the same data, but they're having a totally different perspective from it.
That's a beautiful thing, Catherine, to be able to talk to people outside of our own bubbles. And, you know, so much of what we experience is built on the algorithm of creating our own bubbles, right? And so to retrain ourselves to do that, or give ourselves opportunity to be able to listen outside of our bubble is really a gift that needs to be developed more.
Yes, I think our society would be maybe better off if we had to do some outside of our bubble time once a week.
Does anyone else have any comments? Ruth Ann?
I was going to say, I actually, you know, I have a brother who's a Trump supporter, only one in my whole huge family. And then I just learned a friend, an older friend, she is, as well as my oldest friend here, also, and her husband also supported Trump in 2016. And, you know, I would never want to jeopardize any of those relationships. And so that's kind of the way I kind of look at these people that are very special to me, but they're, you know, very, very different in how I think. I just try to put myself in their shoes, and like I said, I would never want to jeopardize those relationships. So I do whatever I can to try to be empathetic and understanding. And so that's just where I'm coming from. And that's kind of how I treat my phone calling too. And actually the way I start out my calls is asking people if, you know, I'm reaching out for, you know, State Representative Melanie Stansberry. And she, you know, would like me to reach out to voters to see if you have any questions about getting a ballot or in-person voting. You know, I tell them I have all this information at my fingertips. You know, do you have any questions? Is there anything I can help you with around voting? And then so then I get them talking that way if they want to, you know, if they want to go that far. And then I kind of bring up Melanie and ask if if Melanie Stansberry has their support in this November's election. And anyway, that's kind of how I try to break the ice.
Yeah, and being an informative or helpful neighbor can also help break the ice too if you're not ready to launch into a vulnerability story. You can also talk about, you know, I'm actually checking on my neighbors to make sure they're okay. You know, COVID's this is the long haul, and you know, I'm gonna make sure that everyone's doing okay, and you know, on a certain candidate's behalf or something. You know, so
That's good too. Yeah.
Yep. COVID sucks, but it is an opportunity to demonstrate empathy, I think, strongly. So.
Wow. Anybody else have anything they want to add about their personal observations tonight?
Very helpful. Thank you.
Sorry it was so much information. It was just like.
No, it's okay.
It makes sense now. Yeah. Well, with that, I think I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and I'd especially like to thank Catherine for sharing her immense knowledge. I mean, there are probably very few people who know the stuff you know and can communicate it to laymen like us in such a way that we can go, I think I need to try that.
It's a curse too, though, because I see bad messaging come across the television. I'm like, no. So,
I understand. I'm a former journalist, and I can't stand misspelled words and
exactly.
news articles, billboards. So for follow-up action, Catherine, you said that you would be getting to Flora some
I'll make a list of resources
materials that we could maybe access through the Democratic Party of Bernalillo County website, so that we can practice these things. And you'll also have, well, Flora already has a copy of your presentation, so maybe we could make that available. And then this session is being recorded, and depending on the quality, you know, we'll listen to it back. We may be able to make that available as well.
Okay.
Is there any other follow-on action that I might have missed for anybody?
Is it okay for you with you if I add that yours to our Google Drive, your presentation?
Sure. I mean, I might want to smooth it a little bit, maybe do some more explanation, because I think there's some slides on there without explanation. If you don't have it, you may not have any idea what I'm talking about. So
I'll wait till you do that.
Okay. I'll try to read it as like from a newbie's point of view. So
Thank you.
And would anybody like to do some practicing beyond tonight?
Once I've had a chance to absorb some of it.
Okay, well,
Sure.
That's why I want to get the slides. I want to get certain phrases and hang them on my wall so I can look at them again and again and again and really get to know it.
yeah. Well, I'd love to practice some of this. I obviously need it as much as anybody. And if so, let me know, and, you know, we can get a thing going.
we need a persuasion voters handbook, I think.
Ah. Ooh, you said
We're
that's
at time,
the right
Catherine.
people.
Please,
Well, I mean, I think that these things each need here's some examples. Now make your, like, here's an exercise to, right?
Mhm.
Like, here's a okay, purity. Now make a moral argument around purity. Make an verbal argument around in-group, out-group effect, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you can explain it all you want, but I think you have to practice because it's
Yeah.
not natural. So
Very much so.
I'm an engineer. I study before I practice, before I take the test.
Sounds good. Well, thank you again, everyone. This has been so enlightening. And Catherine,
thank you for
best of
having
luck
me.
to you in your new endeavor in January.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you all for putting this
Bye.
together.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Ruth Ann.
Yes.
We hope to see you around more.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Good
Catherine.
night.
Night, everybody.
Good night.